that's one of my most like the topic that I'm most interested in. Why does divination work? Why does astrology seem to work? Why do certain astronomical events seem to coincide with particular patterns of events in human history? Like it's hard to
Yeah.
say for sure why, but I think trying to, think of theories is really fun. It's really fun.
Sure, for sure. Yeah, especially when it gets to very complex systems of divination, like how some of those come together and why they're effective or not effective in some instances. Like what makes one effective, let's say, or one not effective in terms of just individual practitioners. I think have different systems that speak to them more for some reason, and why that is, or why one resonates with one and or another doesn't. But I think a lot of these, it seems like they do, if you break them down, go back to some basic properties where they're trying to get to something core about the nature of the cosmos and how it works. And one of the things that's interesting to me about the I Ching is how it's breaking it down into numbers and number symbolism, and also basic concepts of polarities or binaries, and that there is something like fundamental about that, that it's tied into, or that it's actually getting to the core of about our reality and about our perception of reality, that is probably like the code that's underlying everything in some ways, like you said.
That's one of the things I really love about the I Ching is that it does bring all of these ideas together. That it is math, but it's also divination. It's something mystical, but at the same time, it's also descriptive of the movement of the stars, the movement of the seasons.
Yeah, and it's very familiar to us today because we have like physicists and other people that do things like that, where they try to figure out what is the core structure of the cosmos, and sometimes trying to take it down to first principles.
I do think we get a lot of Confucianist influence into how we today interpret the I Ching line text as well.
So it's more the commentary tradition that developed subsequent to it,
Absolutely.
which is still old, is like 2,000 years old at this point,
Right.
but nonetheless is not necessarily part of the core of what originally developed around the 64 hexagrams.
Hard. I mean, I guess it depends on who you ask, right?
In just Chinese history in general, writing a sort of like commentary on the I Ching became almost like a literary exercise that many intellectuals would engage in at certain points in their career.
Absolutely. And there were like whole out scholarly wars.
Think you wrote at one point in the book that there was an interesting change between like one of the school of thought and their commentary from when that philosophical approach was more dominant would say one thing, but then one of the other commentaries later would have a much different interpretation that was influenced by their religious views.
Yeah, absolutely. And even what to place emphasis on. So are looking at the, the lines, the yin and yang lines and interpreting it based on the values of yin and yang lines and sort of the conceptual symbolic correspondences of the five changing phases and the eight trigrams. Do you focus on that? And that is the, determinative way to interpret an I Ching reading, or do you focus on the line text and the words, or is the words the most important way to interpret an I Ching reading? And there's different schools of thought on that. You can't say one is right and the other is wrong. It's just different philosophies and approaches to the I Ching.
Got it. Okay. Do you feel like a point that I meant to ask you, my partner, Lisa Scheim, she's used the I Ching and tarot and different forms of divination and cards, especially for years. But she said she has always felt like the I Ching has a unique personality, sometimes in the way, in the advice that it gives or the way that it gives advice. Do you think that that's, to what extent have you experienced that? Have you experienced that at all? Or do you feel like different forms of divination have different modes of like answering certain questions? Or is there any uniqueness to those different forms of divination?
I think isn't that what Aleister Crowley said? So Crowley made this comment. He said that the spirit intelligence that's driving, for example, geomancy, were gnomes, and then he said the spirit intelligence driving the tarot was Mercury or Hermes, and then he said that the I Ching is this much older spirit intelligence that doesn't have its own agenda. So he kind of implied that if you use the tarot, Hermes, the spirit intelligence driving the tarot, has its own agenda sometimes, but that he felt like that the I Ching's, the voice, whatever divine or spirit voice was coming through with the I Ching, there was no agenda. And I find that that resonates with my own experiences of the personality, if you will. If you were to personify the I Ching, if you were to personify the tarot, I find that the I Ching can sometimes be harsher it can be a lot more blunt. I think sometimes it tells it to you a little bit like too real, like it's a little too much for you to digest in the moment. And then, however, I find that it's very matronly and motherly for me. So it's like very strict with me when I need the unfiltered truth in a way that nobody else will give it to me. But at the same time, if I'm truly broken, like if I'm really, like truly in a bad place, I find that the voice is very nurturing. Like it has such a gentle, nurturing voice. Like it just almost knows what tone to take with me based on its ability to detect the level of health of my mind, you know? So I think that's something really interesting about the I Ching.
So you do experience it as if something is speaking to you or
Absolutely.
interacting with you
For
in some way?
me, yes, absolutely. For me, I definitely feel like the I Ching is sentient in some way. And how exactly that is expressed, I don't know. Is it channeling some sort of divine voice? Is it Sangdi? Like this, there is this idea. Oh, so actually, there's this idea of different types of divination systems having particular voices. So what Crowley said about spirit intelligences is a very old idea in Chinese metaphysics. So there's a divination system called Tai Xuan Jing, which is very similar to the I Ching, but has three different lines instead of two. So instead of the binary of yin and yang, it has three different types of lines, heaven, earth, and humanity, and it forms tetragrams. So lines of four, I believe it was, for a total of 81 tetragrams. And so Tai Xuanjing was believed to be, the spirit intelligence behind that was Zhou Tian Xuanyi, the lady of the nine heavens. There was another Gui Cang. Gui Cang was one that they believed was either the Queen Mother of the West, that was the spirit intelligence, or the Moon Goddess was the spirit intelligence behind that divination system. So likewise, if that is to be believed, there were a lot of line references that people use as evidence in the I Ching line text that says that the spirit intelligence of the I Ching is what we call Shangdi, which is like sort of the one God of heaven, the one God of heaven, the one God that was first born out of the Tao. That idea of the monotheistic expression of the divine is what is fueling the voice of the I Ching.
Wow, okay. That makes a lot of sense. It's like that idea of like the universe, that we are the universe experiencing itself, and using the I Ching to understand the universe and to understand your life. It's sort of reflecting something back into you that's just helping you to look into your life and understand it better, even though ostensibly you're asking an external entity for advice, but in some ways you're getting insight into what's going on inside of you.
Because they're interconnected. You can't know one without the other. How are you supposed to know your place in the world if you don't know the world? You have to have the context, which is the world, to know where you fit in. So to know one, you have to know the other. You have to know yourself before you can know the universe. But to know yourself, you have to know the context, which is the universe. It's kind of like a circle, right?
Yeah, it's like a never-ending circular process then, but maybe instead of just a complete circle, maybe it's like a spiral because maybe you're making progress as you're doing that so that you're also moving forward in time.
Yeah, which is actually sort of the core thesis of the I Ching, that it's a circle, it's a cycle, and it keeps repeating itself. But every time it cycles, it spirals into an expansion. So it's the idea of the spiraling universe that creates through expansion. And so it's that cycle that keeps on going and it forms the mandala.
Well, there we have just tied things back into astrology because astrology is also looking at cycles and planetary cycles, and those go in circles, but also in spirals moving forward in time. But that then is probably the core of both of these, is they both study change and movement and time in different and unique, but potentially complementary ways.
Yeah, I like that. I like how you brought it back full circle. No pun intended.
Full circle, brilliant.
Yeah, there's a lot of free references up there. And if you're into the I Ching, there's a lot of free coursework on the I Ching and how to utilize the book. So it's a good place to go if you want to get free downloads.
Cool. All right. I'll put a link to it in the description below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website where people can find out more. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.